Hey, y'all. I'm Chris Heaven. I'm the CEO of Survival Dispatch and the host of Survival Dispatch News. All of the current economic indicators are showing that some form of collapse is on the horizon. Things cannot continue on the way that they are. However, I am not a subject matter expert on these things, but my friend Rick from landofland.com is an expert in these things. So I asked him to come on and explain how we got to this point and what the average Joe can do to protect themselves going forward. Full disclosure, we have no affiliate relationship with landofland.com. If you buy property from them, we do not get a commission. This is not a paid advertisement. This is important information that we felt that we needed to get out to our followers with regards to economic survival. Thank you for joining us. And we're back. And y'all may recognize my friend Rick from Land of Land. Thanks for joining us again, Rick.
Hey, Chris.
Rick probably knows more on the topic of economic survival than anybody I've ever met. So, Rick, all of the indicators right now are that some sort of collapse is imminent. It's on the horizon. How do we get to this point, number one? And number two, what can people do to protect themselves and their families?
Well, it is my view that the United States is the greatest country in the history of the world. In World War I, we saved Europe millions of lives at the expense of U.S. soldiers and the U.S. Treasury. In World War II, we saved China from the butchering by Japan. And after World War II, we didn't take over Japan like we easily could have, despite their aggression, but rather rebuilt the country into a thriving democracy at U.S. taxpayer expense. In World War II, we also saved Russia from certain defeat by the Nazis with a huge donation of trucks, planes, and tanks, and then stupidly allowed Stalin to take over Eastern Europe, effectively under slave-like conditions, while we rebuilt Western Europe under the Marshall Plan at U.S. taxpayer expense. Just terrible mismanagement, especially given the amount of leverage we had at the time. We were the only country in the world with atomic weapons, but chose peace and worldwide stability instead. Then we gave Russia and China permanent seats in the United Nations Security Council with a veto on any worldwide rule, effectively making the organization now worthless.
Yeah.
During the Korean War, we saved South Korea at great U.S. taxpayer expense, and we continue to monitor the demilitarized zone bordering North Korea with U.S. soldiers at U.S. taxpayer expense. For more than half a century, U.S. Navy ships have patrolled the world's waterways, enabling trade and enriching nations along the way at U.S. taxpayer expense.
Rick, I just want to say one thing. Sorry to interrupt, but you're the only person who has ever raised that topic of our Navy essentially facilitating global trade at our expense. It's a really interesting comment on your part. This is the second time I've heard you say it, but kudos for honing in on that.
It's upsetting to me that none of our politicians seem to regard the U.S. taxpayer as an important constituency, when in fact that should be the primary constituency with regard to decisions that are made both domestically and internationally. And so we continue to provide billions of dollars annually in humanitarian aid to countries around the world, while China uses their billions through the Belt and Road program to lay claim to strategic assets. So we just give money away that's effectively squandered by despots running these countries that enrich themselves. China, on the other hand, gets liens on strategic ports and power plants and so forth, so that they have places to bring their military. We spend a fortune so inefficiently. We talk about, the U.S. military spending $800 billion a year, and China only spends, $250 billion. But our money is not spent efficiently. I promise you, they get a lot more out of their $250 billion than we do out of our $800 billion. So the fact that we're spending more doesn't necessarily mean that we're getting more value out of it. So we also allowed China to grow into a major economic power through entry into the World Trade Organization, despite its bad behavior. We idealistically agreed to Paris Accords, which required the U.S. to atone for its previous sins, make as though we're bad and we have to, have retribution against us, by reducing carbon emissions at a greater rate than other countries,
Mhm.
which causes our costs to be higher than the rest of the world, putting us at a strategic disadvantage from a trade perspective. Our politicians insanely allow people just to walk into our country as though countries have no borders or rules and provide for them at U.S. taxpayer expense. We choose to enrich countries that hate us and teach their children to hate as well, which really it is a big issue for me, is the fact that we allow countries when we have the economic might to stop it, but we just allow it to happen, that we allow them to teach their children to hate us. And in doing so, we don't use our own natural resources. We could easily cause the price of oil and natural gas to drop precipitously, which takes away power. It takes away the power of Russia to invade the Ukraine. It takes away power of Middle East countries from fighting one another and funding terrorism. It takes away power of Venezuela, and bad behavior around the world. We're creating instability and causing greater pollution worldwide by having the oil pulled out of places where there aren't environmental and safety regulations that we have domestically. So we're promoting hateful, dangerous, and destabilizing agendas, including wars, based on idealistic notions that don't make any sense.
Rick, let me just throw one thing in. The last numbers that I saw when I looked into, you mentioned the Paris Accord, is that somewhere around 3% of, global pollution, which I think is baloney anyway, is attributable to us, and 50% is attributable to China. So, like you said, we're saddling ourselves with all this additional expense in pursuit of this lowering carbon monoxide or carbon monoxide, I guess it is. But nobody else is playing by the same rules.
I understand that, and that's problematic for me. It's just mismanagement, and that gets to where we're going with this. Which a couple other points, and then we'll circle up and talk about the implications. We fund our military at great U.S. taxpayer expense to make NATO a powerful deterrent
Mhm.
for aggression by bad actors in the world. And other countries are allowed to just have a free ride. We'll just join NATO and let the U.S. taxpayer bear the burden of our protection. And we just allow it to happen. And it's amazing to me that, some big boy in the room doesn't stand up and say, listen, if you want our protection, there's a cost to it. The U.S. taxpayer is not going to be the whipping boy for the world any longer. Our politicians promise student loan forgiveness, fat government union contracts, tax credits, no changes to Social Security or Medicaid or Medicare in order to preserve power, even though it's in the long-term worst interest of our country. Our deficits are exploding. Our debt is projected to reach more than $50 trillion within a decade. We bring in about $5 trillion this year. We spend about $7 trillion. In a decade, we'll have $50 trillion in debt and close to $2 trillion a year in just interest expense. You can't cut interest expense. We're going to get confronted with a situation in which it's going to be too late, and we're going to have to make painful cuts. We're going to have to make difficult decisions, and those decisions are going to be surprising to people who are making decisions about who they're voting for without thinking about the long-term implications of it now. And what's going to happen is that the Federal Reserve is not going to be able to control interest rates. The Federal Reserve only controls the front end of interest rates, the very, very short-term rate. The long-term rate is dictated by the market. And when the market sees that we've got $50 trillion in debt at, say, 4% interest, and we're looking at $2 trillion a year in interest expense, and that our total input, let's just say, is $6 trillion a year by then, and a third of every dollar that comes in goes out in the form of interest expense, we just simply don't have enough to be able to, and we can't tax our way out of it to control, that the Social Security and Medicare and Medicaid and defense spending, and what's going to happen is because we cannot default on our debt, we're going to have to start monetizing the debt. In other words, we're going to have to start printing more dollars. It's the only way that we're going to be able to meet our obligations. And when we start printing dollars and the market starts seeing that if I loan the US government money for 10 or 30 years, I'm going to get paid back with confetti.
Mhm.
And so I demand a much higher yield to compensate me for this risk. Then interest rates go up further, and we have a snowball that continues to go down the hill. And it gets bigger and bigger because now we have $60 trillion in debt with an average interest expense of 6%. And now we've got $3.6 trillion of interest expense. It becomes overwhelming. It overtakes us. And that's the direction in which we're heading. And it's frightening to me from an investment perspective, because certainly you don't want your investments to be blown up by the dollar losing its value and losing its reserve currency status, which is not guaranteed, by the way, and I think likely to be lost at some point along the way. But also the world, as we're unable to fund our military, becomes a much less safe place. And the danger is not only going to be worldwide, it's also going to be leaking onto our mainland. It's going to cause instability here. It's going to lead to civil unrest, in my view, and it's going to lead to chaos and bad actors getting emboldened around the world. And I'm fearful for it. So, understanding that I'm not looking to get into politics, and there's no way that I want to bang my head against the wall by talking to the current politicians and trying to convince them of a sane domestic or international policy. The best thing you can do is protect yourself and your family, understanding that this scenario is almost a mathematical certainty, and it's going to happen. So, look in 10 years, or come back in 10 years, make a note on your cell phone or whatever artificial intelligence thing is prominent at the time, to go back and look at this video 10 years from now and see how accurate our prognostications are.
Rick, when you said, this is going to embolden these bad actors, the first thing that came to mind is the gang from Venezuela, TDA, Tren de Aragua. They've grown from next to nothing barely 10, 11 years ago to a huge force, a huge economic force of evil. They'll work on behalf of any other criminal organization that's willing to pay their fees. They're the number one purveyor of child sex trafficking now, not just in America, but the entire world. And of course, you've seen all this stuff where they've taken over apartment buildings from the top down. They've been told, if you get engaged with the cops, just go ahead and shoot them. It's this emboldenment, I guess I should say, is already happening, and it's already having pretty dire consequences. This is a small gang, or what was a small gang. What happens when it emboldens people like Iran, North Korea, Russia, China, all of those countries that want to see us knocked off our perch? It's scary stuff. Agreed.
Well, we're doing it now. I mean, we're in a vortex effectively, and they're laughing. It kind of reminds me of the show Sanford and Son, and we're the big dummy. You big dummy. The United States taxpayer is the big dummy for electing politicians that promote policies that are putting us in this position. We shouldn't be in this position. I understand when, we're in World War II and we've got to run into deficit spending in order to fund our military because, we've got a dire situation, or even to some degree COVID or the great financial recession of 2008. But when things are good, you've got to be the adult in the room and say, I'm taking the candy ball away. You don't just get candy all the time. Just because I gave you some yesterday when you were sick, you don't have tonsillitis anymore. Give me the ice cream back.
So, Rick, I don't know if there's a good answer to this question or not, but and before you make suggestions on what people can do in light of all of this, what's driving these America Last politicians? They're Democrats and Republicans are, the same bent where everything is America Last that's put us in this situation. Is it just personal enrichment? You take somebody like AOC, who was a broke bartender several years ago and now is worth 27, 28, 29 million dollars. Do they put America last solely because it puts money in their pocket individually, or is there something bigger going on that's trying to destroy the fabric of our country?
Well, I from a Christian perspective, I've got to think that they're just idealistic
Okay.
and don't have a good sense of the world. I can't think, other than maybe the George Soroses of the world, that they're really trying to undermine the America's future. They just aren't smart enough to understand that the policies that they're implementing have major long-term
Okay.
consequences.
Fair enough. So, taking all this into consideration, what are your recommendations for what people can do starting right now to protect themselves and their families?
Well, I'd like to have a place to go to the extent things get chaotic in domestically. A second location, an escape retreat. As you know, I'm a big proponent of land
Mhm.
and having some land in a more remote place. Maybe closer to the center of the country. A little further away from the coastlines would make some sense. I also feel that given that the dollar's value is likely to decline over time for the reasons that we've laid out so far, that you want to put some of your assets, maybe a lot, maybe a little, but in tangible assets
Mhm.
such as land, which from my perspective solves two problems. Number one, it gives you the utility of the escape retreat while also giving you portfolio diversification and protection from the inflation that I view as inevitable.
Yeah, I mean, great point. When we first met, I couldn't believe the volume of properties that you have at the prices that you have. I mean, $1,000 for a parcel of land just seems mind-boggling to me. And I think at one point in time, you said that your average sale price is maybe $5,000. I mean, these are numbers that people can put on a credit card and have somewhere safe to go to. I'll just throw one comment in here. My friend Keith Graves, when this topic comes up, he recommends that people buy property that is just over a tank of gas away from the closest metropolitan area, so that if and when the shit hits the fan, if you can't, like if an EMP struck, there'll be no gas pumps. And if there's no gas pumps, the majority of people will not be able to leave the city and get any further away than one tank of gas. So his suggestion is to be beyond that threshold, which he's the only person I've ever heard say that. And for us, it's kind of disconcerting. We have land in North Georgia, but people have been coming from Atlanta for years now, and we're not far enough away from it, to be quite frank. We're in a very rural location there, but we're still really close to Atlanta, and Atlanta is a mess at the best of times.
Well, for $100, you can get a couple extra tanks of gas that you can, keep available in your garage should you need to throw them in your trunk.
Yeah.
So, get one tank away and then effectively give yourself a second or third tank of gas. That's smart thinking.
Yeah, Keith's a unique individual. I mean, I would add a couple things, I guess. So 83% of Americans live in urban centers. When we poll our audience, urban survival is the number one topic, kind of tied with EMPs. Those two go back and forth, but they have nowhere to go. So if you have nowhere to go and you're stuck in the city and we have economic collapse or economic and political collapse, it we don't need a crystal ball to predict what's going to happen. We've seen this happen in other countries. When Baghdad fell, for example, there was a period of somewhere between 48 and 72 hours where all hell broke loose and people stole everything that wasn't nailed down. But by day number three, there were gangs of marauders on the streets taking stuff away from anybody and everybody that they crossed paths with. And to suggest that we would have anything different is just not legitimate, right? So in my mind, if you have somewhere to get away to, then you can start doing the basics, right? Food, shelter, and water being the basics. And if you have that piece of property that you can escape to, and you have something like, those types of preps stocked up, uh, those people are the ones that are going to survive really bad stuff. I mean, I always come back to this, Rick. Uh, if people are willing to beat the hell out of each other over a TV on Black Friday, what are they going to do when there's no food available?
It's a damn good question. And the point is, like your friend Keith points out, plan ahead, right? Buy the stuff that you need now so that if there were a problem, and obviously there's a situation in November, either way, regardless of the outcome of the election, a lot of people are going to be unhappy, and how it manifests itself is unclear, but there is a risk, 5% chance of crazy stuff happening, 80% chance of crazy stuff happening, some percentage chance. And when you say that there's say only a 5% chance of some civil unrest and chaos happening and riots, that's enough for me to say I really want to take some action to protect myself. Sure, one thousandth of 1%, okay, I guess I can accept that risk. But at 5% or 2%, that's enough where you should do something about it. And at a minimum, get extra food and water so that you can hunker down. At a maximum, have an alternative location to go to, and be a little more aggressive about how you stock yourself.
Well, there's an old adage that comes to mind that if you fail to plan, you plan to fail. Pretty straightforward, right? I mean,
Understood.
most people don't have any type of contingency plan. They have nowhere to go. They haven't stocked up on food and water. And, you know, my friend Dr. Jason Dean says as long as they have their bonbons and their Netflix, they're good to go. And nothing else really, sinks in with them, sort of thing. So I would also throw in, just for the sake of discussion and consideration for our audience, is that okay, so you buy a piece of land for a small amount of money and you start developing it. What, maybe you put a container on it, you put some preps there, those sort of things. But again, I come back to, if people are willing to beat the hell out of each other over a TV, imagine what they're going to do when they find out that you have food and water. I mean, you have to be able to defend those sort of things. I mean, if you live in an urban environment and you have nowhere to go, and you've got solar panels and batteries and you're cooking food, it won't take very long in an SHTF situation for, a large number of people to come and take what you have. There's no defense against, think of the zombies in the movies, right? When they just wave after wave after wave comes, you're not going to defend yourself against that. It's an exercise in futility. So my point is that people need to get training as well. They're perishable skills. So they need to get training. They need to do their training on a regular basis, because I can tell you right now, if you have an elevated heart rate and you haven't practiced shooting with an elevated heart rate, and you haven't practiced shooting while you're physically on the run, your chances of hitting the target are slim to none. It's why 17% of shots fired by cops actually hit the intended target, because the stress level is so high that they're not inoculated against it. They're not prepared for it. When I train and I do this 5 days a week with live fire and dry fire guns, my heart rate's over 140 beats per minute for 45 minutes straight. And I've been doing this for years. And if I stop for a month, well, like, can I get it back? Yeah. But again, these are perishable skills. So I think at the end of the day, like, in light of all this craziness, and, correct me if you think I'm wrong, but seems to me it's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when we have economic collapse. Whether anything else happens, like you said, civil unrest, we can leave that out of the equation. So economic collapse, which means you have to have stuff stacked up right now. You have to have a diverse portfolio if you're going to have any well-being. What else would there be, Rick, other than land that maybe people could invest in as well, so they have something tangible?
Well, tangible. Okay. Gold, clearly.
Okay.
Uh, from a diversification standpoint, you could be looking at, Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies, but clearly that's not a tangible asset. We're looking at something that's effectively an inflation hedge, anticipating the decline of the value of the U.S. dollar as the U.S. government has to issue more dollars. The U.S. dollar is worth the full faith and credit of the U.S. government, which is X, and it's significant, but it's X divided by the denominator, which is the number of dollars in circulation. Much like a company's earnings are divided, the total amount of earnings that a company has divided by the number of shares. It's earnings per
Yep.
share. Not how much they earn, it's what your piece of it is. And when there's a lot more dollars in circulation, each individual dollar is worth less and less. And so, how do you protect yourself from that? The government has inflation protection, protected securities, which is one way to go. As the dollar's issuing, paying you back effectively, they're going to have to pay you back with more and more dollars, exacerbating the problem to some degree, but protecting you. And what other assets? I'm a big proponent of real estate, but after going through a variety of different scenarios, I keep coming back to land
Mm.
as the superior alternative. Uh, in one respect, you've got the opposite of what the dollar has, which is the potential for a huge supply coming onto the market, right? The supply of anything increases, the value of it declines.
Right. He,
You're never going to have more land, and so the denominator for the land is fixed. It's the opposite. The denominator for the land is the X, and the numerator is the number of people, right? And the demand for the land, and that in turn is going to grow as the value of each individual dollar shrinks. We need to grow. We need to have plant food. We need to have place. We need as the population invariably gets bigger and bigger, people need a place to stand. I can't tell you what the next medical breakthrough is going to be, but I know that people are going to need to stand somewhere and eat something.
yeah, it's interesting as you were saying all of that. I was thinking to myself that I read an article recently that said a hamburger in Venezuela is 1 month's worth of wages for the average person. I mean,
Crazy.
yeah, because of this rampant out of control inflation that they have. And you touched on the other aspect of food, of growing it yourself. So here's a couple interesting numbers for you. At the end of World War II, over 50% of Americans got their fruits and vegetables from their own garden in their own backyard. That number now is less than 1%. And I don't know if you caught this, but several years ago, the FDA and I believe the USDA said, if you have a garden, we want you to register it with us. And I thought to myself, that's a pretty strange request. And besides the control aspect to it, I'm thinking to myself, I wonder why they've done that. And then somebody made this point in another article I read is that it basically said the government doesn't want you growing your own food because they can't tax you for the labor, they can't tax you for the food that you're growing, they can't tax you when you trade that food in a parallel economy for something else. And hence the reason they want to clamp down on it. It's crazy stuff.
The US government is the absolute least efficient way to utilize resources,
Yeah,
right? Any
right.
small business person, has a certain amount to work with. And every manager of a big company or owner of a small company is judged on how effectively they utilize those resources.
Right.
When you go to the government, there's no sense of that whatsoever. It's
Exactly.
it's just like pissing money away. It's embarrassing. It's offensive to me as a taxpayer, and I'm just disgusted, to be honest with you, with the lack of accountability for the
Yeah.
Congress and politicians in general. That there's no regard for the U.S. taxpayer.
Yeah, it's mind-boggling stuff. Well, listen, Rick, I appreciate all your insight. We're going to get this information out to our audience right away because my personal feeling is that this storm on the horizon is much closer than most people think it is, and that the system is incredibly fragile, and it won't take much to push us into a really, really bad spot.
Well, we would be happy to help if anyone is seeking to purchase land. We have excess inventory that we auction off each week at landofland.com. There's some bargains there, so take a look and see if there's anything that appeals to you. But peruse the options and see if there's anything that looks interesting. But one way or the other, protect yourselves, protect your
Mhm.
families, because you're not going to be able to stop this tidal wave that's already headed towards the shore. And there's absolutely no will for our current politicians to stand up and say something that's unpopular.
Yeah,
You,
very,
you
very true.
cannot be a good parent. You cannot be a good steward. You cannot be a good manager unless you're willing to stand up and say no,
Yeah,
right?
well, absolutely. Very, very well said, Rick. So there's a link below that people can click, take them to landofland.com. They can see what you have in stock. If you don't have land in their state, they can email you and you can keep them informed. Is there anything else that our followers need to know as far as buying land and working with landofland.com in particular?
Know what you're voting for. Educate yourself.
So,
Think for yourself. That's the best advice I can really give you. Before you decide to go to the voting booth because you saw a TikTok video or because your
yeah,
idiot friend suggested that you should vote for, person A or person B, understand what the topics are, understand what each person represents, and understand that the direction that you go, it has a real impact on our future. We are at a pivotal moment right now, after which it's really too late
I,
because we're
I
not going to be able to stop it.
Yeah, I've been saying for years, Rick, that the first thing you do is decide what you want, and the second thing you do is decide what you're willing to give up to get it. And a lot of people don't think of that second step when they make their decisions, especially when it comes to voting for people. But listen, Rick, I really appreciate your insight. I don't think enough people speak in terms of economic survival, preparing for economic collapse. And I think the writing's on the wall and it's just a matter of time. So, Rick, once again, I appreciate all of your insight, appreciate your time. God bless America.
Anytime, Chris.
Land of Land, your trusted source for extraordinary vacant land across America that expresses your unique, special passions while diversifying your investment portfolio and hedging against runaway inflation. Imagine the thrill and prestige of land ownership, owning a piece of America, making the best investment on earth as simple as an online purchase. Off-the-grid serenity, pricing from $1,000 payable by credit card. Visit us today at landofland.com, America's premier land wholesaler for over a decade.